In an age of fear, her knowledge was her crime. Genevieve, the herbalist, was condemned as a witch. High Inquisitor Theron sentenced her to the pyre, his verdict absolute. Her life was forfeit. But destiny had a darker design. That very night, the Inquisitor was struck down by a deadly poison, and the key to his survival was now locked in a cell, waiting for the flames. The air in the great hall was colder than the stone itself, a damp chill that had nothing to do with the autumn evening. Outside, and everything to do with the man who sat upon the dais. It was not a throne he occupied, but a severe, high-backed chair of dark, unforgiving wood, placed before the emblem of the faith, a golden sunburst that seemed to offer no warmth at all. Below him, in the center of the hall, stood Genevieve. The rough-spun tunic they had forced her into did little to ward off the cold, but it was the sea of hostile eyes that truly made her shiver. Fishermen, merchants, mothers who had once sought her remedies for their children's coughs now stared at her as if she were a serpent in their midst. The man on the dais was High Inquisitor Theron. He was not old, perhaps 40 years of age, with a face that looked as though it had been carved from granite and then left out in a harsh wind. There were no lines of mirth or kindness, only deep-set grooves of conviction. When he spoke, his voice was not a shout, but a low, grinding tone that carried to every corner of the silent hall a sound that promised judgment without mercy. He gestured to a crude wooden table beside her, where her life's work was laid out like evidence of a heinous crime. There were bundles of dried wolfsbane and nightshade. Herbs she used in a minute, careful quantities to ease pain and fight fever. There were her mortar and pestle, stained with the green of countless leaves, and her small, leather-bound journal where she sketched plants and noted their properties. Theron lifted the journal, his gloved fingers handling it as if it were dripping with poison. He did not open it. He did not need to. His verdict had been decided long before she was dragged here. He began to speak of a shadow falling over the kingdom of Asper, a creeping darkness of heresy and forbidden arts. He proclaimed that the work of the purifiers was a sacred duty to cleanse the land of those who consorted with ancient evils and turned away from the light of the sun. He spoke of unnatural cures and whispers in the dark, his words painting a picture of a vast conspiracy against the righteous. Then his gaze, sharp and piercing as a shard of ice, fell upon Genevieve. He announced to the hall that this woman, Genevieve of Whisperwood, was a practitioner of such darkness. He pointed to her herbs, calling them instruments of corruption. He held up her journal, declaring it a book of blasphemous pacts. He did not offer proof. He did not ask questions. He presented his certainty as fact, his faith as evidence. A farmer was brought forward, a man whose prized livestock had fallen sick. He would not meet her eyes as he mumbled that he had seen her near his fields the night before, a claim she knew to be false. It did not matter. The story fit the Inquisitor's narrative. Genevieve stood tall, her silence her only shield. To speak would be to give him more words to twist. She could explain that wolfsbane in the right hands could regulate a racing heart, that her journal was nothing more than the study of a healer. But she saw the futility in the hard, zealous light of his eyes. He did not want truth. He wanted a symbol. He needed a witch to burn to fuel the fears of the people, to solidify his own power as their sole protector. Her silence seemed to agitate him more than any protest could have. He rose from his chair, his shadow stretching long and monstrous in the torchlight. He raised his voice for the first time, the sound cracking like a whip through the hall. He pronounced the sentence. She was found guilty of witchcraft, of heresy against the sacred order. Her punishment was to be purification by fire. The sentence was to be carried out at dawn. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, a sound of fear and morbid satisfaction. Genevieve felt the words land like physical blows. Dawn. The word was a death knell. Her mind, usually so clear and ordered, felt like a shattered mirror. She saw flashes of her small cottage, the smell of drying herbs, the warmth of her own hearth. All of it was gone, condemned by the unbending will of one man. Two guards, their faces impassive, seized her arms. Their grip was brutal, designed to remind her of her powerlessness. They began to drag her from the hall, her feet scraping against the cold stone floor. As they pulled her toward the heavy doors that led to the dungeons, her eyes met Theron's one last time. There was no triumph in his expression, no sadistic glee. There was only the terrible, serene conviction of a man who believed he was serving his God. It was a fanaticism so pure it was more terrifying than any simple cruelty. The descent into the dungeons was a journey into another world. The air grew thick and heavy, laden with the smell of damp earth, mildew, and human misery. The torchlight gave way to oppressive darkness, broken only by the guard's single lantern. They threw her into a cell, the iron door clanging shut with the sound of absolute finality. The lock turning was the last sound she heard from the world. Above, she was left alone in the suffocating dark. She pressed her face against the cold, damp bars of the small window, a mere slit in the thick castle wall. It offered no view of the sky, no glimpse of the moon or stars, but she could hear it. A new sound rising from the courtyard outside. It was the rhythmic thud of a hammer against wood, the grating of a saw, the low-voiced commands of men at work. They were building her pyre. Every strike of the hammer was a beat in a countdown to her own. Death, a methodical construction of her final moments. The sound promised a dawn she would not survive. The hammering stopped. For a long time the rhythmic, brutal sound had been a strange sort of company, a physical manifestation of her dwindling time on earth. But the silence that followed was worse. It was a void, a heavy blanket of absolute certainty. The work was finished. Her final stage was set. In this suffocating quiet, the reality of dawn became a predator, stalking her in the darkness of the cell. Genevieve slid down the damp stone wall, the cold seeping into her bones, and for the first time since the verdict, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of her despair. It was a cold, crushing thing, a poison of the spirit against which she had no antidote. Hours crawled by, each one a small eternity. The darkness was not complete. A sliver of faint, silvery light from a high grate offered the barest outline of her prison. She could see the rusted iron ring on the wall where some poor soul had been chained, the faint scratches in the stone that must have been a calendar for another condemned prisoner. She was just one in a line of victims, a fact that offered no comfort, only a deeper sense of futility. Her knowledge, her skills, her entire identity had been rendered meaningless. In the eyes of the world above, she was no longer a person. She was an idea, a symbol of evil to be publicly erased. A soft scraping sound at the door made her flinch. A small slot at the bottom opened and a wooden cup was pushed through, followed by a hard piece of bread. A moment later, a face appeared in the gloom of the slot. It was a young woman, a guard, with wide, frightened eyes that held not hatred, but a deep, sorrowful pity. Genevieve recognized her as Alara, one of the guards from the hall. The girl said nothing, but her expression was a confession of shared humanity in a place that was meant to strip it away. Genevieve reached for the cup, her fingers trembling slightly as she took it. The water was stale, but it was the first kindness she had received since her arrest. She drank slowly, the simple act of swallowing a strange anchor to a life that felt like it was already over. When she looked back, the girl was still there, her face a pale moon in the darkness of the door. The guard finally spoke, her voice a near inaudible whisper. She told Genevieve that she was sorry. She said the last woman in this cell, an old midwife from the river district, had also been taken at dawn. The guard confessed that the midwife had been kind to her family once, and that she did not believe she was a witch either, but belief, she whispered, was a dangerous thing in Silverguard now. The small confession hung in the air, a fragile thread of dissent in a fortress of fanaticism. Before Genevieve could respond, the girl's eyes darted nervously down the corridor, and she was gone. The slot slammed shut, leaving Genevieve in darkness once more. But the encounter had changed something. The pity in the guard's eyes had pierced through her shroud of hopelessness. It did not give her hope for escape, but it reminded her that she was still Genevieve, a woman of flesh and blood, not just the monster of Theron's sermons. She was utterly alone, a single flickering candle in a kingdom consumed by a storm of fire and faith. But even in the darkest dungeons, a story finds a way to travel, a whisper of injustice that can cross oceans and continents. Let us know in the comments from what corner of the world her story has reached you. Sometime later, the bells of the High Cathedral began to toll, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the stone. It was not the call to prayer, it was a summons. From her cell she could hear the faint, distorted echo of a voice, amplified by the stone courtyard above. It was Theron. He was speaking to the city again, his words a distant river of zealotry. She could not make out the phrases, but she knew their substance. He was stoking the embers of their fear, turning neighbor against neighbor, promising them safety in exchange for their suspicion. He was not just executing her, he was using her death to tighten his grip on the soul of the kingdom. The world was being remade in his image, and she was trapped beneath it. A cold anger, clean and sharp as a shard of glass, began to replace her despair. They could take her life, but she would not let them take her mind. She sat up, her back straight against the cold wall. She closed her eyes and began to recite them, a silent litany in the dark. Aconite, belladonna, foxglove, hellebore. She listed their properties, their uses, the precise quantities that could harm, and the exact measures that could heal. It was a small act of rebellion, a way of holding on to the truth of her knowledge against the lies that would kill her. She was a healer. Her mind was a garden of remedies, not a den of witchcraft. She continued this mental exercise, a quiet ritual of defiance as the hours bled into one another. The world outside her cell was a place of rising hysteria and celebrated cruelty, but in the small, dark space of her own mind, there was order, there was logic. There was the immutable truth of nature, a truth Theron, with all his power, could not change. It was this truth she would hold on to. She would face the dawn, not as the witch he had created, but as the scientist and healer she had always been. The thought did not promise salvation, but it offered her a sliver of peace, a final, unbreakable piece of herself to call her own. The silence from the courtyard remained, a patient, waiting thing. Dawn was coming. The light was changing. The faint silver glow from the high grate had begun to soften, bleeding into a deep, bruised violet that spoke of the coming dawn. It was the color of finality, the last breath of night before the world was handed over to the sun. This was the hour she was meant to die. Genevieve had made her peace with it, a cold, brittle calm that coated the terror beneath. She had recited the names of her herbs until they became a prayer, a final testament to the truth of her life. She would not give Theron the satisfaction of a screaming, pleading victim. The castle was beginning to stir. She heard the distant clang of a portcullis being raised, the faint shouts of sentries changing shifts. These were the mundane sounds of any other day, a world moving on completely, indifferent to the grotesque spectacle it was about to host. The normalcy of it was a special kind of cruelty. The guards would come for her soon. She imagined their heavy, methodical footsteps, the rattle of keys, the grim silence of the procession to the courtyard. She braced herself for the sound, but that was not the sound that came. Instead, a frantic, chaotic noise erupted from the corridors above. It was the sound of running feet, not the measured tread of guards, but the disordered, slipping haste of panic. There were muffled shouts, sharp and strained with alarm. The fabric of the castle's morning routine had been torn apart. Genevieve rose to her feet, her carefully constructed calm shattered. This was not part of the ceremony, this was chaos. Her heart, which had been a slow, heavy drum in her chest, began to race. The sound of running grew closer, echoing down the stone steps to the dungeon. A single figure carrying a lantern that swung wildly, casting lurching, drunken shadows along the walls. It was Alara. The young guard was breathless, her face stark white with terror, her hair escaping its neat braid. She fumbled with the keys at her belt, her hands shaking so violently that it took her 3 attempts to fit the correct one into the heavy lock of Genevieve's cell. The sound of the lock turning was not the grim, final sound Genevieve had expected. It was a sound of desperation. The iron door swung inward with a protesting groan. Alara stood there, panting, her eyes wide with a fear that went far beyond pity. She stammered, the words tumbling out in a frantic rush. It was the High Inquisitor. He had collapsed in his chambers. He had been reviewing text for the day's sermon when his aides heard a choked cry and the sound of a heavy fall. They had found him on the floor, his body rigid, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The royal physician, a man named Kalen, had been summoned, but he was helpless. He had tried smelling salts, administered tinctures, even attempted to bleed the Inquisitor, but nothing worked. The great Theron, the purifier of Asper, was dying, and no one knew why. Alara's voice dropped to a terrified whisper as she described the scene she had just witnessed. She spoke of the Inquisitor's skin, once ruddy with conviction, now pale and clammy, drenched in a cold sweat. She described a strange, web-like pattern of dark veins spreading from his neck, and a faint sweetish scent in the room, like bitter almonds. She confessed that he was convulsing, his limbs jerking uncontrollably, and that a creeping paralysis was beginning to steal over him. As Alara spoke, something inside Genevieve shifted. The fear for her own life receded, replaced by the sharp analytical focus of the healer. Her mind, a library of botanical knowledge, began to fly through its catalog. Pale skin, convulsions, paralysis, the scent of almonds. The symptoms were a key unlocking a very specific, very dark door in her memory. It was not a common ailment. It was not a disease. It was a poison. She pictured the page in her old journal, a detailed sketch of a deceptively beautiful flower with dark, glossy berries. She saw her own careful script next to it, noting its properties. A potent and elegant poison, fast-acting and notoriously difficult to trace. A concoction so rare, so complex, that only a true master of the herbal arts would even know its name. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow, leaving her breathless. Nightshade kiss. The High Inquisitor had been struck down by a weapon from her own world. Someone had used the very knowledge she was condemned for against the man who had condemned her. The irony was so profound, so staggering, that it was almost laughable. The world had not just tilted on its axis, it had inverted completely. She looked at Alara's terrified face, then passed her to the open cell door, a gateway back into a world that had cast her out. The sounds of the pyre being built were long gone. The dread of her own execution had vanished. In their place, a new feeling was dawning, a cold, sharp, and brilliantly clear thought that cut through everything else. Leverage. Dawn was no longer an ending. It was a negotiation. The knowledge Theron had named witchcraft was now the only thing in the world that could save him. Her curse was now her crown. The woman he was about to burn had, in the space of a single heartbeat, become the most powerful person in the kingdom, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she would not let that power go to waste. The world snapped back into focus. The frantic, terrified face of the young guard, the oppressive dampness of the dungeon, the open cell door. It all became sharp and clear, like a landscape after a lightning strike. The shock of the revelation had passed, and what it left behind was not joy, not relief, but a profound and chilling calm. It was the calm of a deep frozen lake, its surface smooth and unbreakable. The fear that had gnawed at her for hours was gone, burned away by the sheer staggering magnitude of the opportunity before her. Genevieve was no longer a victim waiting for the flames. She was a player who had just been dealt the single most powerful hand in the kingdom. She looked at Alara, truly looked at her, for the first time. She saw not just a frightened girl, but a tool, a message, a key. Genevieve took a slow, deliberate breath, and when she spoke, the voice that emerged was not her own. It was a version of herself she had never met before, a voice stripped of all tremor, steady and low, and full of an authority she did not know she possessed. She told Alara to be still, her calm tone cutting through the guard's panic like a sharp knife. The girl froze, her wide eyes locked on Genevieve, sensing the monumental shift that had just occurred. Genevieve's mind, once a sanctuary of botanical facts against the terror of her fate, was now a workshop rapidly designing the architecture of her future. This was about more than just surviving the dawn. A stay of execution was a temporary reprieve, a pause before the axe fell again. Theron, if he recovered, would be a humiliated and vengeful enemy. No, survival was merely the first step. The plan needed to be absolute. First, freedom. She required a full and unconditional pardon. It could not be a quiet backroom deal. It had to be a public declaration, proclaimed before the same people who had gathered to watch her burn. It had to be irrevocable, etched into the royal record so that no man, not even the High Inquisitor himself, could ever undo it. The charge of witchcraft had to be expunged from her name forever. Second, security. A pardon was only a word. She had seen how easily words could be twisted. She needed something tangible, something real. She required a grant of royal protection, a decree that would place her outside the Inquisitor's reach, and with it, new life. A small estate, a house with a proper laboratory, and most importantly, a garden. A high-walled garden where she could cultivate her craft in peace, her work funded by the crown itself. They would not just free her, they would be forced to become her patrons. They would protect the very knowledge they had sought to destroy. In a single night, the truth she held had become more powerful than any sword or crown. It was a weapon forged in secret, now ready to be wielded in the light. If you believe in the power of truth to change the world, press the subscribe button and follow her story to its conclusion. The final piece of the plan clicked into place. The delivery. She could not entrust the nuances of her demands to a terrified girl. She needed to present her terms to someone who would understand the stakes. Not a guard, not a courtier, but a man of science. The royal physician, Kalen. He was her true audience. He would recognize the name of the poison, or at least understand the authority with which she spoke of it. He would know that his own conventional methods were useless. He would be the one to convince the others that she was not bluffing. She turned her full attention back to Alara, her gaze sharp and commanding. She began to issue instructions, her voice leaving no room for argument. She told the guard to go directly to the royal physician. She was to repeat her words exactly. First, that the High Inquisitor suffered from the effects of Nightshade Kiss. She made Alara repeat the name twice to ensure she would not forget it. Second, that it was a complex alkaloid toxin for which no common cure existed. Third, and most importantly, that the herbalist Genevieve of Whisperwood was the only person in the kingdom with the knowledge to formulate the antidote. And then, the final critical instruction. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that made Alara hold her breath. She told her to inform the physician that she was willing to save the Inquisitor's life. But her knowledge came at a price. She had terms, and she would discuss them only when they brought her to him. Alara stared, momentarily stunned by the sheer audacity of the condemned woman. But the certainty in Genevieve's eyes was more powerful than any order the guard had ever received. She nodded, a silent vow of compliance, then turned and fled, her footsteps echoing down the corridor, this time with purpose instead of panic. Genevieve was left alone once more, standing in the doorway of her open cell. She did not retreat back into the darkness. She remained on the threshold, a liminal figure between damnation and salvation. The game was afoot. The silence of the dungeon was no longer oppressive. It was expectant. It was the silence of a held breath. She was no longer waiting for her death. She was waiting for their answer. Every passing second was a testament to her newfound power as the life of the most powerful man in the kingdom drained away, waiting for her decision. The choice was no longer his, it was hers. The silence in the dungeon stretched, thin and taut. Genevieve remained in the doorway of her cell, a sentinel at the crossroads of her own fate. She did not pace. She did not fidget. She simply waited, her entire being focused on the sounds from the corridor above. The minutes felt like hours, each one a testament to the poison working its way through the High Inquisitor's veins. With every passing moment, her position grew stronger, his grew weaker. This was a negotiation where time itself was her greatest ally. Finally, she heard them. Footsteps. Not the frantic, panicked pace of Alara, but the heavy, deliberate tread of armored men accompanied by a lighter, shuffling gait. A small delegation appeared at the top of the dungeon stairs, their lanterns cutting through the gloom. At the lead was the captain of the Inquisitor's Guard, a broad, severe man whose face was a mask of contemptuous disbelief. Behind him was an older man, stooped and weary, his fine robes seeming out of place in the filth of the dungeon. This was the royal physician, Kalen. Trailing behind them both was Alara, looking smaller and more terrified than ever. The captain's eyes locked onto Genevieve, his expression a mixture of hatred and grudging necessity. He clearly viewed her as the cause of this chaos, not its solution. But it was the physician's gaze that held Genevieve's attention. Kalen's eyes were not hostile. They were sharp, analytical, and filled with a deep professional worry. He saw not a witch, but an anomaly, an unexpected variable in a deadly equation he could not solve. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgment that her message had been received and understood. The captain barked an order, and 2 guards stepped forward. They did not unshackle her, but grabbed her arms in the same rough grip as before. Yet there was a difference. Hesitation. They were handling a condemned witch who was also, impossibly, their only hope. This uncertainty radiated from them, a sweet scent of fear that Genevieve savored. She did not resist, allowing them to lead her from the dungeon. The journey through the castle was a blur of shifting power, servants flattening themselves against walls, their eyes wide with whispered rumors, courtiers peering from shadowed alcoves, their faces a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. Genevieve was no longer an anonymous prisoner. She was a spectacle, a living paradox at the heart of a crisis that had gripped the entire court. She walked with her head held high, her gaze sweeping over the tapestries and gilded frames, not as a woman cowed by their grandeur, but as one who was about to become their equal. They arrived at the heavy oak doors of the High Inquisitor's private chambers. The guards pushed them open, and the atmosphere within struck her immediately. The air was thick with the cloying scent of medicinal incense, a futile attempt to mask the sharp underlying odor of sickness and death. The room was a testament to Theron's power. Maps of the kingdom, shelves of sacred texts, a desk of polished ebony. But all of it was rendered meaningless by the scene at its center. There, on a vast bed draped in velvet, lay High Inquisitor Theron. The granite-faced judge from the tribunal was gone, replaced by a pale, gasping creature drenched in sweat. His eyes were half open, glazed with pain and confusion. The dark, web-like veins had spread further, a ghastly map of the poison's conquest across his skin. He was a man drowning on dry land. His weakness was a physical presence in the room, more powerful than any of his guards. Physician Kalen approached the bed, his expression grim. He turned to Genevieve, his voice low and urgent. He asked her to confirm what the guard had said, his tone that of one professional consulting another. Genevieve stepped forward, her movement fluid and calm. She looked not at the physician, but at the dying man on the bed. She spoke, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the tense silence of the room. She confirmed the diagnosis of nightshade kiss. She added a detail, noting that the toxin worked by constricting the pathways of the spirit, a concept of alchemy the physician would dismiss, but that the Inquisitor, a man of faith and spirit, might understand. It was a calculated move to establish her superior knowledge. Then she addressed Theron directly. The guards tensed, but Kaelin raised a hand to stop them. Everyone in the room seemed to hold their breath. She took another step closer to the bed, her gaze locking with the Inquisitor's pained, struggling stare. She wanted him to hear every word. The narrator of his downfall would not be a courtier or a historian. It would be her. She began to speak, not with anger or malice, but with the cold, dispassionate clarity of a merchant stating her price. She told him that she could brew the antidote. She explained that the process was complex, requiring a precise balance of rare ingredients that must be prepared before the next moonrise, or his paralysis would become permanent and his heart would fail. And then she laid out her terms. Her voice never wavered as she listed them, each demand a perfectly placed stone in the foundation of her new life. First, a full and public pardon announced in the execution square, rescinding the charge of witchcraft. Second, a royal decree of protection, placing her person and property under the direct authority of the crown, untouchable by any inquisitorial court. Third, the deed to the old Ashwood Manor bordering the royal forest, complete with a stipend to rebuild its laboratory and cultivate its walled garden. The captain of the guard let out a strangled cry of outrage. He called her a demon, a blackmailer, and took a step toward her, his hand on the hilt of his sword. But Theron's eyes, burning with a feverish intensity, were fixed on Genevieve. He understood. He understood the perfection of her trap. He was a man who had built his life on absolute power, and now he was absolutely powerless. A terrible rattling sound came from his throat, a war between his fanatical pride and his body's primal scream to live. The room was silent, waiting for the verdict of the dying man. He tried to lift a hand, but it only trembled uselessly at his side. He squeezed his eyes shut, a single tear of pure, agonizing humiliation tracing a path through the sweat on his temple. Then he opened them again, his gaze finding Genevieve's. He gave a nod. It was not a gesture of agreement. It was a gesture of complete and utter surrender. Theron's nod, a gesture of utter defeat, hung in the air, shifting the gravity of the entire kingdom. The captain of the guard stood frozen, his face a thunderous mask of rage. He looked from his vanquished master to the woman who now held all the power, his expression one of pure, undiluted hatred. He opened his mouth to protest, to call this blasphemy, but the weary voice of physician Kaelin cut him off. The physician stated, with the exhausted authority of a man facing an impossible problem, that every moment they wasted in argument was a moment the poison solidified its hold. His words, practical and devoid of emotion, silenced the captain more effectively than any threat. The immediate aftermath was a whirlwind of controlled chaos, orchestrated by Genevieve herself. She had not merely won a reprieve, she had taken command. She turned from the bed and addressed Kaelin directly, her voice crisp and clear. She gave him a list of what she required: distilled water, a charcoal filter, a silver cauldron, and a series of herbs and reagents. She named several rare plants: moonpetal, dragon's tooth, sun-dusted fern, knowing they were kept in the royal apothecary under the physician's personal lock and key. It was a subtle test, a way of confirming her own value by demanding ingredients that only a true expert would combine. Kaelin's eyes widened slightly in recognition, and he dispatched an aide immediately. Genevieve then demanded a workspace, not the Inquisitor's chambers, which were filled with the miasma of sickness and faith, but the physician's own laboratory. It was a clean, sterile environment, a place of science. It was neutral ground where her work would not be tainted by Theron's lingering presence. Her final demand was the most critical. She stated that while she worked, the royal scribes were to draft the documents she required, the pardon and the deed. She made it clear that the final life-saving dose of the antidote would be administered only when the signed and sealed parchments were placed in her hand. There would be no tricks, no last-minute betrayals. As Genevieve was escorted to the laboratory, the impact of her actions began to ripple through the castle. The news spread like wildfire. The condemned witch was not to be burned. She was in the royal labs, working to save the very man who had sentenced her. The corridors buzzed with panicked whispers, and in a lavishly appointed solar across the castle, Lord Valerius heard the news and felt a cold dread wash over him. His meticulous plan was unraveling into a nightmare. He had chosen the poison for its obscurity, certain that Theron's death would be seen as a mysterious, divine judgment. He had never conceived of this. He had never imagined that the one person in the kingdom capable of creating an antidote was already in the dungeons, a stone's throw away. His carefully crafted assassination was turning into a farce that would not only leave his rival alive, but would also create a new, unpredictable power player in the court, the pardoned witch to whom the Inquisitor owed his life. Panic began to set in. Valerius quietly made his way toward the physician's wing, hoping to intervene, to cast doubt on the woman's abilities, to suggest this was all some demonic trick. But he found his way blocked by the Inquisitor's personal guard, men whose orders were now absolute. No one was to disturb the work of the healer. Valerius was forced to retreat, his mind racing. He was no longer the puppet master. He was just another spectator, watching in horror as his plot backfired in the most spectacular way imaginable. Inside the laboratory, Genevieve worked with a fierce, detached focus. The room was a sanctuary of order and logic. Glass beakers, brass scales, and charts of the celestial bodies lined the walls. She moved through the space as if she had been born there. The aides and Kaelin watched, mesmerized, as she measured, ground, and heated the ingredients. Her hands were steady, her movements precise. This was not the fumbling of a charlatan or the dark magic of a witch. It was a science, an art. It was a truth more real and potent than any of Theron's sermons. Meanwhile, Theron lay helpless in his bed. He was no longer the fearsome Inquisitor. He was merely a patient. He could hear the distant rhythmic grinding from his physician's laboratory, each sound a reminder of his utter dependence on the woman he had condemned. His entire worldview, built on a foundation of absolute certainty and divine right, was crumbling with every passing moment. He had believed knowledge like hers was a corruption. Now he prayed it was powerful enough to save him. The irony was a poison of its own, seeping into his soul. Hours later, as the first true rays of dawn pierced the high windows of the laboratory, the work was complete. Genevieve held up a small crystal vial. Inside was a liquid the color of pale moonlight. At the same moment, a royal scribe entered, his face pale with exhaustion. He carried 2 scrolls of heavy parchment, each tied with a silk ribbon and stamped with the great seal of the kingdom. Genevieve took the scrolls, her fingers brushing against the still warm wax of the seal. She unrolled the first one, her pardon. The second, the deed to Ashwood Manor. Her demands had been met. Her future was secure. She walked from the laboratory, the vial in one hand, the scrolls in the other, and returned to the Inquisitor's chambers. She stood over his bed. Theron's breathing was shallower now, the paralysis spreading. The captain of the guard watched her, his face a storm of conflicting emotions. Kaelin looked on with nervous anticipation. Genevieve held up the vial so Theron could see it. Then she held up the scrolls. Life and freedom, one in each hand. She had won. All that was left was to fulfill her end of the bargain. She uncorked the vial, the faint, earthy scent of the antidote filling the air. She tilted it toward the lips of her enemy, the man who, just hours ago, had promised her nothing but fire and ash. Genevieve's hand was steady as she brought the vial to Theron's lips. The captain of the guard flinched, a reflexive motion of protest, as if he still expected her to pour poison down his master's throat instead of the cure. Genevieve ignored him. Her focus was entirely on the task at hand, an act performed not with mercy, but with the cool precision of a debt being settled. She gently tilted the Inquisitor's head. and ensured the pale, shimmering liquid passed his lips. The bargain was sealed. Her part was done. For a long moment, nothing happened. The only sound in the room was Theron's ragged, shallow breathing. The captain stared, his eyes burning with suspicion, ready to accuse her of a final demonic trick. But then a subtle change began. The violent, intermittent tremors that had racked the Inquisitor's body seemed to lessen in their intensity. A slight, almost imperceptible deepening of his breath followed, his chest rising with more purpose. A faint touch of color, the barest hint of life, returned to his ashen lips. The antidote was not a magical bolt of lightning. It was a science, a slow, methodical reclamation of a body from the brink of death. Physician Kalen let out a long, shuddering breath of relief, his professional duty overriding all other concerns. He rushed to his master's side, checking his pulse, his eyes alight, with a renewed sense of purpose. He looked at Genevieve, his expression one of pure, unadulterated awe. He had just witnessed the impossible. The captain, however, simply looked lost, his world of rigid certainties collapsing around him. The witch had performed a miracle. The demon had become the savior. His hatred now had no logical place to land, and it left him adrift in a sea of resentful confusion. Genevieve allowed them a few moments to absorb the reality of the situation before she made her next move. She had fulfilled her side of the contract. Now it was time for them to fulfill theirs. She turned to the captain and the physician, her voice calm but unyielding. She stated that the High Inquisitor was stabilizing, but the second part of their agreement could not wait for his full recovery. The public announcement, the revocation of her sentence, had to happen now, while the pyre was still cold and the crowd was still gathered. She would not give them a single moment to regroup, to rewrite the narrative, to betray her. The captain began to protest, claiming his master was too weak, but Kalen, surprisingly, agreed with her. The physician understood the delicate politics at play. He knew that any delay would be dangerous, and that the only way to solidify this fragile truce was to enact it publicly, immediately. And so a procession unlike any the castle had ever seen was formed. The High Inquisitor, leaning heavily on two guards, was led from his chambers. He was a ghost of the man he had been, pale and trembling, but alive. He was alive because of the woman who now walked beside him. Genevieve was not in chains. She was not a prisoner. She walked with her head held high, the scrolls containing her future held securely in her hand. They emerged from the castle gates and into the pale morning light of the execution square. The crowd, which had been murmuring with impatient anticipation, fell into a stunned, breathless silence. They had come to see a witch burn. Instead, they saw the witch walking free and the Inquisitor, their iron-willed protector, looking as fragile as a man made of glass. The sight was so illogical, so completely contrary to the world they knew, that no one knew how to react. They simply stared, their minds struggling to comprehend the scene on the dais. Theron was helped up the steps. Every movement was an agony of physical weakness and profound humiliation. He stood before his pyre, the monument to his own hubris, and looked out at the sea of confused faces. The captain of the guard stood behind him, a stony-faced statue of defeat. Genevieve stood to the side, a silent, powerful observer. She had no need to speak. Her presence alone was a statement. Finally, Theron spoke. His voice, usually a commanding force of nature, was a weak, rasping thing, barely carrying over the silent square. He did not look at Genevieve. He could not. He recounted a story, a carefully constructed fiction they had all implicitly agreed to in his chambers. He spoke of a cowardly plot against him, an assassin's poison meant to strike down the arm of justice. He then gestured with a trembling hand toward Genevieve. He declared that this woman, through her profound knowledge of nature's secrets, had uncovered the plot, and, as a loyal servant of the faith, had crafted the cure that saved him. He had to praise her. He had to laud the very knowledge he had condemned. With every word, a piece of his authority seemed to flake away. He publicly and formally revoked the sentence of witchcraft. He declared Genevieve of Whisperwood a friend of the court, a protected citizen of the realm. He had to sanctify the woman he had tried to destroy. A great rolling murmur swept through the crowd. Shock, confusion, relief, and 1,000 other emotions mingled in a wave of sound. The narrative Theron had so carefully built over weeks had been shattered by his own words in a matter of minutes. People looked at Genevieve differently now. She was not just a woman who had escaped the fire. She was the woman who had brought the firebringer himself to heal. She was a power unto herself. As the guards began to lead the weakened inquisitor away, his gaze met Genevieve's. In that fleeting moment, the public performance fell away. There was no gratitude in his eyes. There was only the cold, hard acknowledgment of his defeat. He knew she had beaten him, not with magic, but with intellect and courage. And she, in turn, let her gaze show him that she knew he knew. The public battle was over. Her name was cleared. Her life was her own. But as she stood on the dais, the warm morning sun on her face and the cold, unused pyre at her back, she knew the private war between them had only just begun. As Genevieve descended the steps of the dais, the sea of people parted before her. It was not the panicked clearing it had been when they thought her a witch, but a new kind of separation, one born of awe and a deep, uncertain fear. They looked at her, not as a fellow citizen, but as a living myth, a woman who had faced the fire and emerged not only unscathed, but with the Inquisitor's power humbled in her wake. She walked through the silent, staring crowd, her gaze fixed forward, the scrolls that held her. Future clutched in her hand like a scepter. She did not need to look back. The scent of her victory was carried on the morning air, far more potent than the lingering smell of wood smoke from the city's hearths. While she was being escorted to her new life, High Inquisitor Theron was being returned to his gilded cage. His chambers, once the epicenter of his power, now felt like a mausoleum for his own authority. He was physically recovering, the antidote slowly, methodically, purging the poison from his blood. But a deeper sickness had taken root in his soul. His certainty, the bedrock upon which he had built his entire identity, had been shattered. He, the purifier, had been saved by the unclean. He, the voice of absolute truth, had been forced to proclaim a lie before his entire flock. He would sit for hours, staring at the sacred texts that had once provided all the answers, but their words were now hollow. His guards moved about him with a new hesitation, their reverence replaced by a discomfiting pity. The captain of his guard, a man who had once followed his orders without question, now looked at him with a silent, simmering resentment. Theron had compromised. He had traded his sacred principles for his own survival, and in doing so, he had become mortal in their eyes. This was his true prison. He was not locked in a cell, but in the ruin of his own infallibility, a torment far more exquisite than any he had ever devised for his victims. The despair of Lord Valerius was of a different, more frantic nature. The news of Genevieve's triumph and Theron's recovery had been a death knell to his ambitions. His plot had not only failed, it had created a legend while leaving his enemy alive. And Theron, stripped of his divine aura and desperate to reclaim his authority, needed a target. He needed to prove that the threat of an assassin was real. The Inquisitor's vast network of spies and enforcers, the very apparatus designed to hunt heretics, was now turned inward, a furious serpent consuming its own tail. It was hunting for the poisoner. The poetic justice was swift and brutal. Theron's fanaticism, the very quality Valerius had hoped would lead to his rival's downfall, became the instrument of his own. Valerius found his world shrinking by the hour. Servants were questioned, his known associates were detained, and his political allies began to distance themselves, unwilling to be caught in the Inquisitor's renewed, desperate crusade. He became a prisoner in his own lavish home, starting at shadows, his every waking moment filled with the terror of discovery. The end came without ceremony. The Inquisitor's guard, led by the grim-faced captain, stormed his manor. They found Valerius not defiant, but a broken, weeping man. His cunning collapsed into pure terror. He was dragged from his home, his cries for mercy ignored. The same system of swift, unquestioning judgment he had admired from afar was now clamped around his own throat. The wheels of justice, once set in motion, often grind on their own. Theron's crusade had turned inward, and Valerius was the first to be consumed by its fire. The satisfaction of seeing a villain face their deserved fate is a powerful feeling. If you felt a spark of that satisfaction in this moment, take a second to press the like button. News of the arrest reached Genevieve as she stood for the first time in the overgrown garden of Ashwood Manor. The estate was modest, its stone walls covered in ivy, but to her it was a fortress of solitude and safety. An official from the court had delivered the deed and a heavy purse of gold for its restoration. He also informed her, with a tone of grim satisfaction, that the Inquisitor's poisoner had been found and had confessed to his crimes. Genevieve listened, her expression unreadable. She felt no joy, no thrill of victory. She felt only a quiet, detached sense of completion. It was the feeling of a complex equation finally being solved, its variables canceling each other out. Theron's pride had led to her condemnation. Valerius's ambition had led to Theron's poisoning. Her knowledge had led to her freedom. And now, Theron's humiliation was leading to Valerius's destruction. They were all just elements in a reaction she had merely catalyzed. She walked through the tangled garden, her fingers brushing against the leaves of wild, untended plants. She saw not neglect, but infinite potential. This would be her sanctuary, her laboratory, her world. She had won her freedom, her safety, and her peace. Yet as the sun began to set, she looked out from the hill upon which her new home sat. In the distance she could see the sharp, dark spires of the High Inquisitor's citadel piercing the twilight sky. Valerius was gone, but Theron remained. He was weakened, diminished, but he was still there, and she knew that a man like him would never forget the woman who had forced him to his knees. The battle was won, but the peace was a fragile thing, and she would have to tend to it as carefully as she would tend to her new garden. The fragile peace held. Days bled into weeks, and weeks into months. The sharp, biting winds of autumn gave way to the deep, quiet cold of winter, and then softened again into the damp, hopeful air of spring. Through it all, Genevieve worked. Her life, which had been a chaotic maelstrom of fear and survival, now found a new rhythm, one dictated not by the whims of an inquisitor, but by the steady, patient cycles of nature itself. Ashwood Manor, once a place of neglect and decay, slowly came back to life under her touch. Her first and most devoted efforts went into the garden. She spent weeks clearing the tangled weeds and thorny overgrowth, her hands digging into the rich, dark soil. It was hard, physical work that grounded her, a welcome antidote to the years of living inside her own mind. She was not just clearing land. She was reclaiming territory, both literal and metaphorical. With the funds from the crown, she sourced seeds and saplings from across the kingdom, planting not just the potent herbs of her trade, but apple trees, climbing roses, and simple kitchen herbs. The garden became a living tapestry of her new life, a place of beauty, sustenance, and carefully cultivated power. Inside the manor, a dusty storage room was transformed. Walls were plastered, new windows were installed, and sturdy workbenches of oak were built. Slowly, it became the laboratory she had only ever dreamed of. She acquired gleaming glass beakers, precise brass scales, and a small, efficient furnace for distillation. It was a sanctuary of logic and science, a fortress built of knowledge. Here, she was not the witch of Theron's imagination, but a scholar, a chemist, a master of her craft. She had taken their gold, the price of their fear and desperation, and forged it into a shield of independence. Her reputation in the city underwent a similar transformation. The tale of her ordeal had become a local legend, and the fear it once inspired had curdled into a deep, grudging respect. People no longer whispered the word witch when her name was mentioned. They spoke of the healer of Ashwood. At first they were hesitant, but desperation soon overcame their fear. A noblewoman arrived one day, her young son burning with a fever that physician Callan could not break. Genevieve, after a moment of careful consideration, admitted them. She worked calmly, preparing a poultice and a tincture, and by nightfall the boy's fever had broken. News of this success spread, and soon a quiet but steady stream of visitors made their way to her door. A wealthy merchant with gout, a stonemason with a festering wound, a young woman suffering from melancholic humors. Genevieve was cautious. She turned many away, choosing her cases carefully, never explaining her reasoning. She was not the village herbalist anymore, available to all. Her knowledge was a precious resource, and she would dispense it on her own terms. She was no longer a public servant. She was a private power. In the quiet evenings, sitting by her own hearth, she would often reflect on the lessons her ordeal had taught her. She had learned that true power was not wielded from a throne or a pulpit. It was the simple, undeniable currency of possessing a skill that the powerful needed. Theron had legions of guards and the blind faith of thousands, but in the end, all of it had been useless against a single drop of poison. Her knowledge had been her only true weapon and her only real shield. She had also learned about the nature of justice. She had not sought vengeance against Lord Valerius, yet he had been destroyed. His own ambition and Theron's wounded pride had created a self-consuming fire. Justice, she realized, was often just the logical, inevitable consequence of a man's own character flaws. She had simply been the catalyst that set the reaction in motion. She had survived not by becoming like her enemies, but by remaining true to herself, by trusting in the logic and order of the natural world when the world of men had descended into chaos. Of the High Inquisitor, she heard little. The purification movement had faltered, its leader a diminished figure who rarely appeared in public. Theron remained in his citadel, a lion with his teeth pulled, ruling over a kingdom of whispers and shadows. He was a constant, brooding presence on the horizon, but he was no longer the center of her world. One evening, as spring rain washed the world clean, Genevieve stood before a large pane of polished glass she had installed in her laboratory. She looked at her own reflection. The face that stared back was not the same one that had faced Theron in the tribunal. The fear was gone, replaced by a deep, quiet confidence. The lines around her eyes were etched not with terror, but with wisdom. It was the face of a woman who had walked through fire and had not been consumed, but forged. She had lost everything, and in doing so had gained herself. She was not just a survivor. She was the architect of her own peace, a peace she had built with her own two hands, piece by careful piece, and she would protect it with the same fierce, quiet determination. A year passed, and the peace, once fragile, solidified into a simple fact of life. The seasons turned again, and the garden at Ashwood Manor became a masterpiece of cultivated life, a vibrant testament to Genevieve's resilience. Her laboratory was a respected center of healing, and her name was spoken with a reverence that bordered on legend. She had built more than a home. She had built a legacy on the ashes of her own near demise. One late summer afternoon, as she was pruning her roses, a lone rider approached the manor. It was not a patient or a court official. It was High Inquisitor Theron. He came without his guards, without his clerical robes, dressed in the simple dark attire of a minor nobleman. He looked older than his years, his face a road map of his own internal defeats. The fire of his fanaticism had been banked, leaving behind only the gray ash of weariness. He did not come as an inquisitor, for he held no power here. He came as a man in need. The poison, though neutralized, had left a permanent echo in his body, a recurring tremor in his hands, a faint ache in his joints that grew worse with the damp air. It was a constant physical reminder of his humiliation, a debt his body would never let him forget. and the only person in the world who knew how to soothe it was the woman who lived at the end of the path. Genevieve met him at the gate to her garden. There was no fear in her, no anger, not even the cold satisfaction of victory. There was only the calm, appraising look of a healer observing a patient. She did not invite him into her house. She simply listened as he stiffly described his ailment, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere over her shoulder, unable to fully meet her eyes. Without a word, she turned and walked into her garden, plucking a few silver-leafed herbs from a shaded patch near the wall. She went into her laboratory and returned moments later with a small corked vial containing a dark, fragrant oil. She handed it to him, her movements clinical and detached. She explained the dosage, a few drops rubbed into the skin when the tremors began. It was a simple palliative, a measure of comfort. He took the vial, his fingers brushing against hers for a fleeting second. He offered her a purse of coins. She refused it with a slight shake of her head. This was not a transaction. This was a statement. He was not a customer to be served. He was a consequence to be managed. She had no need of his gold. Her power over him was far more absolute than anything coins could buy. He stood there for a moment longer, a man stripped of all his former weapons. His faith had failed him. His power had been broken. His health was now dependent on the continued grace of the woman he had tried to murder. He finally gave a short, stiff nod of acknowledgment, turned, and walked away, his retreat down the path far more of a defeat than any of his public humiliations. He left her home, a man no longer defined by his power but by his weakness. And she remained, a woman defined not by the fire she escaped, but by the world she built from its ashes. Hers is a testament that no wall is high enough and no dungeon is deep enough to extinguish spirit determined to rise. They tried to burn her story to the ground, but they only succeeded in planting the seeds of a legend. If this story has inspired you, help us bring more tales of unbreakable spirits to the light. Subscribe to this channel and become part of a community that believes in the power of a story to change the world. Genevieve watched him disappear down the road until he was just a small, dark shape against the horizon. When he was gone, she did not linger on the past. She turned her back on the road he had taken and walked deeper into her garden, her sanctuary. The air was warm and smelled of damp earth and blooming flowers. She paused, crushing a sprig of lavender between her fingers, bringing the calming scent to her nose. A faint, genuine smile touched her lips. She was home, she was free, and she was finally at peace.